Welcome, everyone, to the Working Class New York Revisited Conference. My name is Stephanie Lewis, and I'm a faculty member at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at CUNY. We are thrilled to be sponsoring this conference today, co-sponsored with the American Social History Project, Center for Media and Learning, the Gotham Center, the PhD program in history at the Graduate Center CUNY, Queens College History Department, and the New Press. The New Press is proud to be a co-sponsor of the Working Class New York Revisited, the Past and Future of Struggles for Progressive Change Conference. We're here to celebrate the book and to help celebrate Professor Josh Freeman's retirement. Also, the New Press is pleased to offer a complimentary paperback copy of Professor Freeman's book to the first 100 conference participants who request one using the link to a form listed in the chat. Our hope is that this crucial text will continue to be read by the general public and assigned in labor courses and labor education programs for many years to come. So check out the chat and fill out the form to request a free book. So a year ago at this time, New York City was the global hotspot of the deadly coronavirus. This great city had come almost to a standstill as we sheltered in place in fear. But not everyone was in lockdown. Our city's healthcare workers were still going to work, taking care of the sick and dying. Our transit system slowed considerably, but transit workers kept the trains and buses running. New York City workers continue to pick up the trash, sell us our groceries and medicine, deliver our supplies. As Professor Josh Freeman argues, the working class is what made New York City great. And it was the working class that brought the city through the worst of the pandemic. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers continue to go to work, and these were the people who bore the heaviest burden of the pandemic, those who were most likely to get sick and to die. We know from the book, Working Class New York, that this is not the first time that the workers of New York City have rescued the city or defined its greatest strengths. The collective power and social democratic vision of 20th century New York workers won us what we have of a strong public infrastructure, and workers' sacrifices during our last fiscal crisis of the 1970s literally kept the city afloat in those tough years. Tragically, much of the city that the working class had built in the post-war years has been chipped away, defunded, undermined. We couldn't rely on a robust public health system, and tens of thousands of people didn't even have homes to shelter in. The city is less often defined by its working class base today. And instead, we see the polarization brought about by extreme inequalities, tales of two cities rather than a working class New York. But out of the depths of our recent despair, we have also seen working class New York continue to fight back, to organize, to push for protective equipment and safe reopenings, to defend our unions and push the city to do the right thing. It was in this context that we at the School of Labor and Urban Studies knew we wanted to create a space that honors the memories of those who lost their lives to COVID and the service of those who took care of the city, and to strategize about how to rebuild this great city. And there was no better way to do that than to spend a day together celebrating Josh's tremendous book, as well as his retirement. We are a year past the 20th anniversary of the book, but the themes and lessons are as relevant as ever. We are thrilled to have this distinguished lineup of guests with us today and to have so many of you joining us in the audience. The full program and speaker bios are in the link in the chat, so please check those out. But we're starting off this morning with contributions from two remarkable labor historians. First, we'll hear from Jack Metzger. Jack is Emeritus Professor of Humanities, Roosevelt University. He is a prolific author, and many of us know and love his great book, Striking Steel. But he also has a new book coming out this fall with Cornell University Press called Bridging the Divide. And then we will hear from Samir Santi. Samir is one of our newest faculty members at the School of Labor and Urban Studies here at CUNY. He's a labor historian as well as a former union organizer and researcher, and we are so thrilled to have both of them with us today. So I'll turn it over to Jack.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to do a very brief appreciation of Josh's book. I coordinated with Samir And he's going to do the heavy lifting to provide the intellectual framework for the discussions today, which Stephanie has already done a lot of. I'm going to provide a brief appreciation from a point of view outside New York. In the 1990s, I was teaching in a labor leadership program that drew local labor leaders from a wide variety of unions across the Chicago area. One of the things I taught was a 3 or 4 week segment on labor history that followed a traditional curriculum, maybe a 50-year-old curriculum, that emphasized Haymarket, the Pullman strike, the 1919 steel strike, and the Memorial Day massacre, which was part of the 1937 Little Steel Strike. These were all events in Chicago or with a strong Chicago focus. Traditionally, this local focus connected people to that history. And though all 4 events were significant losses for the labor movement, it was routine for these local leaders to feel a deep sense of gratitude for earlier generations' suffering and sacrifices, and sometimes an almost spiritual obligation to carry on the work of their union and the labor movement. But this particular time, this is in the mid-1990s, though all that worked as usual, a young ironworker in his 30s asked a question that resonated with the rest of the class. When did we ever win? And I didn't have a good, ready answer. The late 19th and early 20th century events that we taught had engendered nothing but gratitude in earlier times when unions were used to being successful in advancing their members' wages and working conditions. But by the mid-1990s, union workers in their 30s had lived through more than a decade of concessions, giving away parts of their contracts, either bit by bit or in one disastrous swipe or two. And they were likely looking ahead to much more defense than offense. In fact, a lot of our education was preparing them for that, trying to prepare them for that defense. Our classroom labor history had stopped with the breakthroughs of the 1930s, and we inadvertently assumed a happily ever after climax, even though wages and working conditions hadn't improved much at the point of breakthrough. Josh Freeman was writing Working Class New York at that time, and it answered that young unionist question better than any other single work of labor history of which I'm aware. And for the past 20 years, I've been recommending it to young organizers and other people interested in learning more about the American labor movement. Here's why. Though only about one city, and one usually considered to be an outlier with its absence of massive industrial agglomerations, Working Class New York tells the story of when unions were powerful and effective across many fronts, incredibly powerful and effective when viewed from the perspective of the present. But it also tells a story of the labor movement's fall and of the working class's displacement from a central role in the city. A story peculiar to New York, but like all good literature, somehow more universal in its very specificity. I recommend the book because it covers half a century and so provides a long view, but with the kind of local detail that makes it more palpable, more touching than national surveys can possibly be. It's a history of a labor movement that younger people today can still recognize, one with all the complex racial, gender, and ethnic diversity of garment workers, janitors, the building trades, service workers, teachers, and other public sector workers, not to mention those tugboat workers. Who knew what they did until they shut down the city in 1946? It captures the complexity of the American working class in a way that any focus on a particular industry or union is bound to miss. The other reason that New York is an outlier is that in many ways it was the American labor movement and working class at its best. Politically astute in developing various forms of social wages, from rent control to cooperative housing to health clinics to for a while, ridiculously low subway fares, while performing all the regular functions of American contract-based unionism, socialism in one city, as Josh dubbed it. As the best, or one of the best, the labor movement's demise in New York, much less steep than in other places, in Josh's telling is more like a classic tragedy, precisely because the hero seems so much better than the rest of us. There are other reasons to recommend Working Class New York, and Samir has some good ones coming up. But I'd highlight the quality of the writing and its accessibility to a general audience. The moral balance that Josh maintains throughout, in one situation and analysis in story after another, and the matter-of-fact affection he has for the city and its working classes, always understated, but always there. So even as we focus today on it as a New York book with all the texture and noise of the city, please remember it too as a work of labor history that represents the American working class and labor movement in deep and rich ways that resonate throughout our large and complicated country. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. We may have time for a question or two in this session. So you could go ahead and submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll see if we can get to them. Next, we'll hear from Samir.
Thanks, Stephanie, for those really nice remarks to kick us off and for chairing this session. And Jack, who, as Stephanie noted, is himself the author of a classic study of working class life in the mid-20th century, which I think came out the same year, or right around the same time as the book we're discussing today. It's a pleasure to be kicking off this terrific conference with you. And I'm going to be building on a lot of what Jack just very nicely laid out. And thanks everyone, who's in the audience for being here. I'm really excited for the set of discussions we're going to have today, and feel really honored to be a part of it. I was asked to talk about the significance of this book then and now. And to do that, I want to start with what is perhaps very obvious, but which in any case I think bears emphasizing, this because it's what made the book so special. And that is Josh's unapologetic embrace of the very idea of the working class as a central historical actor. These days, we hear the term working class a lot more frequently than we did about a decade ago or so. And unfortunately, it's a little too often used to refer only to those white people who voted for Trump, often with an unspoken implication that people of color somehow aren't members of the working class. But fortunately, there is also more going on than just that. Thanks to things like the Sanders insurgency and a set of campaigns and organizations that have gained momentum around it, the notion of a working class does seem to be re-entering the popular political imagination. Now, it's one thing to have the idea in circulation and another to have a well-organized mass working class movement that's capable of wielding real political power. And we still have quite a ways to go from where we are to there. But I think it's safe to say that our odds of getting there are certainly better than any point in my lifetime to date. But when Josh wrote this book, however, things were very, very different. Those were the years just after the Cold War, when the labor movement and the left were in complete retreat, and the free market was the only game in town. Economic inequality, which had begun to rise a couple decades earlier in the 1970s, was soaring. And at the same time, officials at all levels of government were dismantling the safety net that had been built over the previous couple of generations. All of this was very much felt within the academy. Public sector retrenchment was making higher education increasingly inaccessible to working class students, with tuition rising in proportion to state funding reductions, and the conditions of work on campus were getting worse and worse and worse. At the same time, the extramural social movements that in the 1960s and 1970s had shaped a generation of students and scholars were in decline, complicating, to put it charitably, the relationship between intellectual work on campuses and the broader social struggles off of them. The academic left became a little more academic and a little less left. And in consequence, class and class relations began to seem tired and uninteresting. So given this backdrop, and given what he was up against when I work on this book, I think it's important to start this conference by expressing real appreciation and admiration for what Josh's intervention meant in its time. It meant something to say working class back then. And just so our audience is clear exactly what Josh meant by the term working class, his definition wasn't at all vague. He used it to refer to, and here I'm quoting, people in non-managerial positions who worked for wages and their structural position in the economy. Structural position in the economy. Then, as now and always, as long as we live under capitalism, I think that's the most precise and useful way in which to use the term. But as much as Josh deserves to be commended for the boldness of his intervention, we gathered here today, I think, all know very well that there is no force on earth weaker than the feeble strength of one, which is to say that Josh's sensibility didn't come from nowhere. Although the book is a history of post-war New York City and stands, I would say, as among the great urban histories that came out in the 90s and aughts, Josh is first and foremost a labor historian. And in particular, he came up within the tradition born out of the radical currents of the 1960s of what was then called the new labor history. To understand what was special about this new labor history, I should say a word about what all of a sudden in the 1960s and 1970s became the old labor history. The old labor history, and here we're talking like 100 years old at this point, was above all concerned with the trade union as an institution, how it developed, how it bargained, and how it stabilized labor management relations. Its pioneers were writing around the time that US society was being shaken by what contemporaries called the labor question, the mass worker upheavals that were rattling the rapidly industrializing economy, things like the Haymarket incident and the Homestead strike and the stuff that Jack talked about in his remarks. And these early labor historians wanted to understand how to calm things down. In fact, it's worth noting that most of these earliest labor historians were not historians, but economists, and specifically economists associated with the profession's institutional tradition, which in the early 20th century was engaged in a fraught intradisciplinary battle with the conservative neoclassical economists who saw collective action and trade unionism as necessarily harmful and inefficient. The institutional labor economists, on the other hand, thought that unions could do some good in bringing order to a chaotic capitalism. And sitting here a century later, I actually think they were asking some pretty good questions. How do the law, psychology, economic concentration, power relations, and other historically determined features of our society affect our economic life? But there was one thing that the old labor historians weren't too interested in, though, and that was workers. And by the 1960s and 1970s, when a very big and bureaucratized labor movement could seem like a given, the trade union wasn't a particularly exciting subject of study for radical historians. Inquiry into workers themselves and their communities, on the other hand, might contain clues into how to revitalize a militant fighting spirit on the left, which was the exact kind of thing that the old labor historians were trying to overcome. Inspired by the innovative and rigorous work being done in large part across the Atlantic, most famously by the great British historian E.P. Thompson, a generation of these new labor historians set about the study of working class life and struggle. Race and gender figured centrally in their work, and the city, the town, the neighborhood, even the individual mill or factory often served as the site of analysis. Taken as a whole, this history from below that the new labor historians did much to create provided an extraordinarily textured picture of the complexity and the contradictions of working class solidarity and struggle. And it's one from which the entire historical profession has benefited immeasurably. But as I'm hardly the first to point out, the limitations of the new labor history were clear, even as that school was in its heyday. What were first the tremors and then the convulsions of global capitalist restructuring had become visible in the 60s and certainly the 1970s. And by the end of those decades, it was clear that the future existence of an institutional labor movement, the way the post-war generation had understood it, could no longer be taken for granted. Yet even as this crisis unfolded all around them, the new labor historians didn't have great answers for this central question of the late 20th century. Why did the jobs go away, and what happened to the communities dependent upon them when they did? The micro may have been interesting, but how much did it really matter when the macro changed? Over the past decade or so, now we're up to the present, a new, younger generation of historians have been setting their sights on these larger structural questions, producing some of the most interesting and high-profile work in recent years. They've been referred to as the new historians of capitalism, and not long ago they even got a New York Times article about them, which means that they have for sure made it. Path-breaking studies have been done on slavery and capitalism, on commodities like cotton, on money, on the financial system, have done much to make historical political economy once again a central scholarly concern. But at the risk of generalizing a bit too much, there is one important feature of capitalist society that remains somewhat underdeveloped in these new histories of capitalism. And that's the working class, or more precisely, class struggle. For many historians of capitalism, their subject is capital, not labor. And their focus is on how things are financed and traded rather than on how they're made, moved, or served. Now, I think there might be a historical explanation for why this generational cohort, which I should say I'm sort of a part of scholars, has moved, for why they moved away from labor and towards capitalism. Perhaps it has something to, or not towards capitalism, towards capital specifically, I should say. Perhaps it has something to do with having come up in an age when all the power in our society has been concentrated in the hands of the ruling class. When the working class struggles that we have witnessed have been largely defensive, desperate attempts to hold on to shreds of things won in the past. Even considering some of the most important fights of the past decade, how many of them can we honestly say were organically rooted in or served to really enhance the collective power of the working class? Occupy Wall Street, DSA, even the Fight for 15 or the Sanders campaigns, I don't think very much. The exception, I should say, which may prove a rule, may be the great wave of educator struggles that began in Chicago a decade ago and which have since spread across the country to red and blue states alike. And I say they may be the exception that proves the rule because, of course, they were tied to the formal institutional labor movement. So here we got a notable paradox, I think. The people under the age of, say, 40, 45, maybe even older, may well be very progressive, but they've only ever lived in a world defined by overwhelming capitalist class power. The very idea that an organized working class could be a force capable of contending with capital and offering a vision that broadly shapes our political life can seem so foreign as to be unthinkable. The absence of such a force is, I would say, the principal reason why our politics have been so brutal and ugly in recent years. And it's also a reason, I think, why many of our historians of capitalism don't also think of themselves as historians of labor. To me, this is why Working Class New York, Josh's book, remains such an invaluable resource. Historiographically, it represents something of a blend between the new labor history that preceded it and the new history of capitalism that's followed, narrating the historical political economy of New York through the city's working class and the struggles it waged for social and economic justice. It's a history of capitalism with class struggle, one that enables us to imagine what a world marked by working class power looks like. The New York described in the book was extraordinary, as Jack and Stephanie alluded to. It had over 1,000 private sector union locals, which together in several industries exerted sufficient power to establish a kind of sectoral bargaining system, just the kind of thing that some unionists today hope to build. It had 3 influential left parties, including the Communist Party, capable of electing their own members to public office and shaping the platforms of those outside their ranks to ensure a sustained commitment to issues bearing on working class life. Above all, the cost of living. Things like rent control and massive investment in public housing, as well as union-financed cooperatives, health and housing cooperatives, like a low-cost mass transit system, like the extraordinary public higher education institute that's bringing us together today virtually, and like a number of publicly and union-funded cultural institutions that offered working people the roses to supplement the bread of housing and health. As Josh puts it really elegantly, looking back from a later era of post-liberalism, social meanness, and labor retreat, what New York workers accomplished during the quarter century after World War II seems utterly breathtaking. And in closing, I want to suggest that as distant and as exceptional as that breathtaking post-war New York can seem, it actually has quite a bit of relevance to our current times, more than we might realize. And that's why Working Class New York, the book, remains such a valuable contribution, not just historiographically, not just in terms of its scholarly intervention, but also politically. New York never developed, as Jack mentioned, New York never developed the kinds of gigantic oligopolistic industries that structured life in other working class cities like Detroit with its auto industry or Pittsburgh with its steel industry, making it what Josh calls a non-Fordist city in the age of Ford. In some ways, the more fragmented and flexible manufacturing that existed in the city, most famously seen in the apparel industry, prefigured the kinds of fissuring that marks our economy today. But unlike in our times, that fissured labor market was organized, in many cases wall to wall. And it was older unions, especially those affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, that proved most adept at organizing in this context. As scholars like Dorothy Sue Cobble and my colleague Ruth Milkman have pointed out, that history may offer some lessons for organizing in our own post-industrial context. And in fact, it's worth noting, as Ruth has observed, that some of the most dynamic organizing in recent years has come from some of those unions whose history stretched way back to the old AFL days. Unite Here and SEIU come to mind. Post-war New York also had a larger than average number of workers involved in distribution, moving and storing things, marketing them on the retail and wholesale trade. Likewise, today, more and more workers are employed in the maintenance of logistics networks and supply chains. And perhaps it's no accident that it was the RWDSU that took the best shot at an Amazon warehouse that we've yet seen. And finally, and I think most importantly for today, post-war New York demonstrated better than anywhere in the country what can be accomplished by robust public investment, together with militant organizing by public sector workers, as well as those employed in industries with lots of public money, like healthcare. In just about every city in the country, more and more people are employed in the work of caring for others. Most of that work, as well as the essential work of caring for our ailing planet, can only be done through the kind of public investment that working class New York fought for and won. But But while that achievement by working class New Yorkers of so dramatically expanding the public good was truly nothing short of incredible, and while we continue to benefit from the legacy of that today in many ways, there were also limits to, as Josh calls it, and as Jack noted, social democracy in one city, something that the 1970s fiscal crisis made all too clear. Then as now, as long as municipal finance depends, at least in the last instance, on private financial markets, there's only so far we can take it. Unlike that 1970s crisis, however, and unlike the one a decade ago after 2008, New York and other big cities are likely to come out of this pandemic crisis in a better fiscal condition than we entered in. And that, of course, is thanks to the massive federal expenditure that we've seen over the past 12 months. And it underscores the extent to which the fate of New York is tied to that of every other city, and above all, tied to Washington, D.C. The future of urban America, in other words, is likely to be determined at least as much at the federal level as it is at city halls and state capitals. And our best shot at steering those politics in a positive direction in the years and decades to come is, like it was back then, through a well-organized mass working class political movement that can show ordinary people who live in cities all over the country, as well as people who don't live in cities, that we all have a whole lot in common. One of the biggest challenges in trying to build that kind of movement, especially for those of us under a certain age, is simply imagining what it might look like. And to help with that, Working Class New York remains one of the best, if not the best thing to read, which is why I'm so thrilled that we're gathered here today to talk about it. So thanks everyone for being here. Thanks Stephanie and Jack, and all the other panelists who are going to come. I'm really looking forward to our discussions today.
Thank you so much, Samir and Jack, and your comments really set the tone for today and frame our discussion. We have time for a couple of questions, and I think some of these are New York specific and some of them are more general. But the first one, I'm just going to follow up on what Samir was ending on, which is in the mid-1970s, New York City experienced a fiscal crisis during which the municipal unions made some significant concessions, even agreeing to layoffs of Black and Latino workers. Yet there was resistance to austerity. What lessons can be drawn from the austerity movement, the anti-austerity movement, beyond the trade union movement? Do either of you have thoughts on that?
You want to take a first shot at that, Jack? Well, it's a great question. I mean, so what lessons can be drawn from the anti-austerity movement beyond the trade union movement? I mean, I think one is, one of the legacies of the austerity of the 70s was deepening retrenchment of the public sector, deterioration of the services that working class people, disproportionately working class people of color, relied upon. And I think, the public sector unions that did a lot to sort of cushion that blow are the workers that provide those services, but the beneficiaries of those services, the communities that those workers also live in, and the communities that folks who don't work in the public sector or who maybe don't work in the formal economy at all live in, depend a lot on those on those services and have enormous stake in it. And I think there's a way in which to imagine struggles for an expansive public sector, hopefully not always defensive against austerity, maybe even offensive in terms of building a new type of public sector that would involve real solidarity and organization building between community organizations and unions. And one example of this, I think, is the bargaining for the common good campaigns that we've seen around the country that have brought, for instance, public educators together with students and parents and communities, and there's a million ways we could think about how that might, how we could, replicate that in other areas.
Great, thank you. We have another question here, which is for either of you, Jack or Samir, could you identify some parallel histories in cities and states other than New York of labor movements at their peak power. And this person asks, there are labor histories of Seattle and San Francisco, but they are specifically looking for books that highlight activism and policy. Or just any thoughts on other labor movements at their peak. Oh, Jack, I think we need you to undo your mute. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I don't think there are other books about cities that are focused just on cities. There's essays, there's things that have San Francisco or Seattle as the background, or Pittsburgh or Detroit. But what's unique about Working Class New York is that it is about the city as seen through the eyes and lives of the working class. And I wish there were more of that. I do think that there's a lot in the history of the CIO that's instructive still today. And in answer to that earlier question about austerity, one of the things that struck me in rereading Working Class New York for this is that the crisis came about 5 or 8 years before the crisis that I'm most aware of, which is deindustrialization. And so I think there was a lot that happened in the anti-deindustrialization movement, the plant closing movement, that is relevant today if the Biden administration is serious about reviving manufacturing and having the government play a larger role in managing the market. That could be learned from that period. But Samir or Stephanie, do you know of a city-based book other than Working Class New York?
Well, Stephanie, you want to? I mean, I'll jump in real quick. I do think there's something exceptional about the way that Working Class New York is structured, and perhaps it has something to do with the exceptionality of post-war New York. But there is, it came out, and I maybe briefly alluded to this. It came out in a moment when urban history was having something of a renaissance, and studies of particular cities. So there's a classic book in this is Tom Segru's History of Detroit. Which again isn't exactly about working class life in the same way as Josh's, but it's about the political economy of the city, which very much bore on working people. And I'll make a plug actually for a new book by a friend of SLU, Gabe Wynant, The Next Shift, which talks about the decline of the steel industry and the rise of the care economy in Pittsburgh, which is very much, I think, in the tradition of working class New York, of blending social history from below with sort of the large structural stories. There's also, I'll note, for Seattle, there was a general strike in Seattle in 1919, and Dana Frank has a very good book about that gets at some of the on what life was like in Seattle during that struggle. So there's histories of strikes and there's histories of cities. Just in the spirit of a partisan promoter of Josh, I do think that this is kind of a one of a kind study, though.
Yes, I'm not a labor historian, so I don't feel I have the breadth here, but there is a book called When Mandates Work about San Francisco, and that's a more recent book. It's an edited collection by Michael Reich and Ken Jacobs and a number of other folks about what the labor movement and allies have done in San Francisco over the past 10 to 20 years in really changing that city. And it's policy focused rather than labor history focused. But since I'm from the Bay Area, I had to mention that one. So, we have, the last question is a tough one, which is, who are the ruling class in New York City and how does their ruling function politically? What does it look like and how do they do it? They're asking to keep this answer specifically to New York City, but I think that, I know you both have expertise in other places. We just have a couple minutes if you have any comments about who is the ruling class in a city and how does that work?
I'm not up to date on who's ruling New York City right now, but in Josh's book, he traces how finance, Wall Street, came to be the ruling class in New York. And it seems to me that that's the ruling class that is sort of invisible in the background, determining both a lot of economic realities, but also a lot of our political realities. So that'd be my guess.
Stephanie, do you want to take a shot at this one? Well, I mean, I'd say, you know, there's another very good book about New York by a scholar, Kim Moody, called From Welfare State to Real Estate. And I think that kind of nicely, you know, adds a little bit of texture to this. I think real estate is a major player. I think financial institutions that again have a lot of control over what municipalities like New York and every other one can spend, have a lot of power. And I think, you know, the composition of the ruling class is often changing, but you know, people who own land and own capital tend to be, or institutions that own land and own capital tend to exert quite a bit of influence over all our lives, even if we don't interact with it day to day.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's New York is a unique story, but every city has its own particular way in which those factors come into play. So I think this is a great transition. We're going to be moving into our next session, which is about New York labor struggles in the post-World War II era, and we'll be picking up on some of these themes. So I wanted to thank Samir Santi and Jack Metzger for your contributions today. I also want to remind people that the first 100 people who fill out the form in the chat will be given a complimentary copy of Josh's book from the New Press. And so hopefully that link is working. There's a couple of if other questions didn't get addressed, I think they're going to be coming up throughout the day. So we really want you to stick around with us. So thank you again, Samir and Jack. We really appreciate your participation this morning.